So, what I'd like to talk to you about today is starting with the journey that I've been on for the last 30 years in terms of development of educational software, and why I've got to the point where I'm trying to do generating exercises automatically and creating adaptive tests. So, if we just start looking, I've been working in software development for the last 25 years. Initially I was working for the British Council as a teacher, and then we opened a department to create, it was called the CD-ROM project, which shows how long ago it was. We were producing materials for the teaching network for the British Council worldwide, and they were general training. So what I found there was that I was the lead technical designer, and I had a couple of gap year students from a computer science course working with me, and then we had 30 writers. So the imbalance between the technical and the pedagogical was massive, and the amount of time that it takes to develop something like this, I've just put up some bullet points there. This is by no means a complete list, but the idea is that we have to start off by developing a framework for the writers, because if you give writers totally free scope, you end up with stuff that is very difficult to put into a format that you can use electronically. So the first thing is agreeing the frameworks and the templates with the editor of the materials and the technical staff, and then developing the software that's needed to support that. Then you have to get the writers on board, and they have to be trained to use templates, and they have to be shown how we're going to be giving feedback and things like that. So there's quite a lot to take on board. Then we have the material creation period, which can be very extensive. And then, of course, there's quality control, editing, creating interactive exercises and activities, trialing, bug testing, and finally maintaining and updating content. So this is quite a long development process, and it costs a lot of money in terms of writers. Now, a lot of my best friends are writers, so I'm not dissing writers in this talk. They are very, very important, but I know that there are certain things that we can do more automatically than that. So what I started working on before I got into assessment, I was into just teaching. So I was into teaching materials, and I was looking at something that we could do to avoid this part of it. So the first thing that I was looking at was, rather than materials-driven content, I was looking at data-driven content. So what we would do there is we would identify a source of the data that we need, and we would develop software around that. So, for example, here is some dictionary data. So what can we do with dictionary data to make something interactive and interesting for students to use? Now, the advantage of this approach using content that is already created is that you then work with the framework you've got and you produce materials from that. So I was talking to a colleague of mine recently saying that I was coming to do a talk at BALEAP, and he said, you know, the last time we were at BALEAP, Graham, was in 2011, and we were doing a commercial presentation. And our commercial presentation was for WordReady. Now, WordReady was based on those dictionary entries, and it was also based on the British National Corpus. So that's a general corpus of English language, and we can produce frequency of words, of occurrences of words. So we took a lexical approach to this. We were using the academic word list, and essentially what students could do is they could choose any text they wanted from anywhere. So they can cut and paste a text. And they would cut and paste the text in here, and it would analyze the text. It would work out which were the words that they needed to learn first in terms of the academic word list. We're assuming that they've got the first 2,000 words of the English language, which is not always a good assumption. but we are teaching specifically the academic word list. So when we start looking at it, for example, I just chose a text here because I thought EAP, we're here for EAP, so why not choose text on EAP? So the word academic appears at the top. And what students can see is they can see that word family, and the bigger the words, the more frequently it occurs in the British National Corpus. So they can see which words are important to learn first. Because very often you'll come across a word in a text and you'll think, okay, that's a good word to learn. But in fact, it could be academia. But in fact, academic is really the core of this word family. So it's important to learn that and then to spread out into the other words. So what they did with this is they would click on a word and they would be given a multiple choice question about what the definition of that word is. So they were able to work out for themselves what the meanings of words they hadn't come across before was. And then over time, this was recycled in more and more productive ways. So we went from receptive to productive. And this app was actually used by 250,000 students who were preparing for IELTS. So I think it was quite successful. But what we were trying to do with this was to show that you could learn just by reading the things that you wanted to read. You could paste a text about your favourite football team in here, and it would find academic vocabulary to cover. So this was 2011, and we were lucky enough to win the Elton Award in 2012 for this. Moving on from there, I joined the University of Wolverhampton as the pre-sessional course coordinator, and I was also given the job of producing online exams. So I produced a secure English language test, IELTS basically, but it was our own version of IELTS. And it was interesting being in room 101 the other day and seeing how many people were trying to throw out IELTS, and I'm with you on that, okay? So if we look at this, educational assessment development, how is it different from developing materials for teaching? Well, it's everything that went before, plus there's material security and life cycle to deal with. If anyone's involved in creating assessments, they'll know that they have a short life cycle, because unless you have a large number of them, it's going to get out what they're about, so you can't really keep giving them the same assessments. So what we found was that creating that IELTS equivalent test was very, very heavy in material development. Plus, of course, we then had to trial it. We had to make sure that all the questions were correctly written, make sure that there weren't any issues with the distractors that were being used, etc., etc. And for a university to do that on its own, it just becomes very difficult to do. It becomes impossible. And what we also find is that it means you can't offer the exam to people all year round. You have to do it at certain points in the year so that you don't have to develop too many tests. So the reason that I was keen on looking at, I'll just give you an example. There you go. So this was part of the reading that we did for the IELTS equivalent. And as you know, we've got, when you've got gap fill like this, for reading it's okay if you're transferring your answers, but very often there is not one correct answer. There may be many correct answers that could go in there. So it becomes quite difficult to mark automatically, and marking can take a long time. So what I wanted to do was see how easy it would be to develop an integrated skills test. So something that was more to do with academic skills and, you know, reading and then producing writing. And I got the chance to do that because apart from this, we also had language support at Wolverhampton University for the students who were there, and we wanted to analyse what their needs were. I've just been to Rob Playfair's talk, and he was talking about needs analysis. So we wanted to see what skills they were lacking, because if they're coming in with IELTS or an equivalent, very often they're coming in without the academic skills that they require. So I got a chance with this because it wasn't a test to see what level they were, it was simply a test to see what support they might need. I was able to move on and develop something that was a little bit adaptive and data-driven. So, with an exam like IELTS, they will aim the questions at roughly the average score that they expect the students to get. So it means students who are scoring 7 or 8, there are far fewer questions to judge that. And the students down at this end have this huge area where they haven't got a clue what's going on. So it's very demotivating. So the idea of adaptive testing is, I'm sorry if I'm talking to the converted. If you understand adaptive testing, I'll just go through this very quickly. The idea of adaptive testing is that you would come in at that central point, you'd give a student a question or two, and then you could adjust the level of the question depending on the student's ability. So you can move up and you can move down. And in that way, all the students, in theory, will get approximately, let's say 60 to 70% correct, which is motivating for students. And it also means that you need fewer questions to actually determine what their level is. So, what I did for this was I wanted to find a corpus of texts. So, luckily, One Stop English had produced a corpus of 189 texts that had been adapted to 3 different levels. This is freely available for research, whatever you want to do. So it's an interesting thing to look at. So what they've done is they've taken the texts and they've put them into advanced, intermediate, and elementary. Now, this is not the advanced, intermediate, and elementary that I recognize as previously an EFL teacher. This is simply banding. So there's 3 different levels that we're dealing with here. And you can see that there are slight differences between the texts. All of the texts in this database are between 400 and 600 words long. So the advanced ones are usually the longer ones, and the elementary ones are usually shorter, with simpler sentences, simpler structures, and different vocabulary. But to be honest, looking at this, the vocabulary that they've changed, it's a bit odd sometimes, because it seems not to be that much simpler. Certainly, if you read that first one, it is written in quite a complex way, and there's only 2 sentences here. Whereas, okay, there's 2 in that as well, and there's 2 in that. So there's two sentences in each of them, but the first sentence in that one is far more complex in the grammatical structure. So what I did was, I came up with a couple of exercises that I thought would be useful for trialing this on. And what I wanted to do was use the texts adaptively. So, judging the level of a text is a very difficult thing to do. And very often, for example, we've got Flesch-Kincaid readability tests and the Gunning-Fogg index. These were developed either for secondary schools in America or for people going into the military so that they could judge their level of reading. So the readability level of these texts, when you start analyzing it, advanced, intermediate, and elementary, they don't actually break up like that at all. We find that some texts, the elementary one is actually higher up than a lot of the other advanced ones. So there's some strange things going on here. What I tried to do, because these ones are looking at average sentence length and average syllables per word and percentage of long words, what I wanted to do was I wanted to align this with the CEFR levels. So I started analyzing texts using the levels of words. Now, that, again, is not straightforward because it depends on the meaning of the word. You find that you get occurrences, depending on the meaning, at different levels within this. But it's a finger in the wind. It's a rough way of measuring things. So what I developed was 2 exercises. The first exercise looks a little bit like this. So this is called a C test. And this is, unlike a lot of the other gapped texts, because the way that this is generated is automatic. So it takes a text, any text, and it will give you the first sentence without any gaps in it to give you the context. And it then gaps every second word, and it gets rid of half of the letters. I think I've just lost everybody in the room, haven't I? Because everyone's trying to figure out the answers to this. But what's interesting about this is that it's not like most gap texts, because you start having to refer back to things, you've got to jump forward to work out what something is, then come back again. So there's a lot of understanding of structure in this. So this seemed like quite a nice way to start. However, what has this got to do with the readability difficulty of the text? Can you judge how difficult these gaps are simply by looking at the readability of the text or the complexity of the text? I can see somebody shaking his head. You can't, can you? You can't. So how do you analyze the difficulty of these things? Does anyone have any suggestions? Because I could do with them. How do you analyze the difficulty of gaps? I suppose the only way to do it is by getting lots of people to do the exercises, as is the case with IELTS, and finding out how difficult things are. So that was a little bit problematic. But what I did was, with this it's easy, because I can mark that very quickly, automatically. It's highly unlikely that there could be 2 correct answers. Highly, highly unlikely. So I can mark that automatically, and depending on the student's result, I can give them a more difficult text, or an easier text, or a text of the same sort of level. And as you can see from the content here, these are very general texts. However, this could be used with texts from the department the student is going into. If you want an in-sessional test, you could do it with specific tests from that department. And as I said, it's automatically generated. There's nothing to do. You just pop all your text in the database, and it produces this. It randomly selects a text at the mid-level, and then it goes up or down, and students are given 5 of these texts. So just looking at the results of that, where are we? There we are. So, lots of pretty dots. I love my graphs, by the way, so I do a lot of these, but I tried to keep this reasonably simple. So with the gap fill, we can see the scores of the students, and we can also see the time that they've taken. And you can see from that there is no correlation between the time they take to do it and how good they are at it, which you'll see why that's relevant in a minute. So another problem that we've got is that we've got a very, very large number of texts here. So far, I don't have enough data to tell how difficult any of these exercises are to do, because not enough students have done each of the texts. But I'm beginning to collect some information. And I find this quite a good assessment of how capable students are. But I think the timing is also really, really important. And that's even more important in the second exercise. How's my time doing? Am I doing okay? Yep, okay. So the second exercise that I decided to do was reading into writing. So they get the full text this time. So they've got text between 400 and 600 words. And their instruction is, explain the main idea of this in 1 sentence. Now, limiting it to 1 sentence was so that they could show off if they wanted to. Most students don't show off that much, but it really focuses their attention on what they need to get down. And again, I would, well, on this one, I couldn't mark this automatically. Back when I created this originally, it couldn't be marked automatically, and therefore, if I wanted to do adaptive testing, I had to find another measure of how good I thought they were. So I used time. So the students who went through it quickly, I assumed, were producing something better than the ones who went through it slowly. How stupid I was. Because, in fact, I'll jump to this slide now. Okay, so as you can see, again, their score is not reflected in the time that they've taken to do it at all, which I think anyone with any sense would know. I obviously had no sense when I was thinking about this. So, again, I found that quite interesting. However, the readability there is far more relevant than it was in the previous exercise, the readability of the text. But that's only half the story, because they then have to produce the summary from that. So how do you rate how difficult the text is to summarize?
Just a quick question. How is the summary marked?
Funny you should say that. I just jumped a slide, and this is the slide I jumped, so this is how it's marked. So what you can see here, I try to simplify this as much as possible, because I wanted it to be as quickly done as we could. So first of all, you can see at the top, 1378, it's anonymized. We don't know who this is. We can see the model answer. Now, the model answer was written by tutors. We went through all the text really quickly and wrote a model answer. But it's not actually a model answer. It's really just a prompt for the marker to know what the text is about. If they actually click on this, they can see the entire text if they want to. So if there's something in what the student writes that they're not sure about, they can check the whole text. But the idea here was that the first thing is task achievement. Have they achieved the task? Have they summarized that text in a way that's decent? So 0, no they haven't. 2, yes they have. 1, and that's a very easy judgment call. It's a lot easier than a scale of 1 to 10. Are they 7? Are they 6? I'm not quite sure. Maybe it's a 6.5. So this is incredibly quick to do. So they get 2 marks if they've achieved that.
Can I just ask another question?
Oh.
It's incredibly easy to do, but if you're dealing with a large number of students, which I imagine at Wolverhampton would be, then it might be easy, but not if you've got 1,000 students to mark.
No, but it's certainly easier than marking it on a, do you give them, you know, between 1 and 20.
Course, yeah.
So just splitting it up into very small bits. Yeah. Did they achieve it? Did they not achieve it? Well, they kind of achieved it. Okay. And I think we can all make that decision quite well and quite quickly. Yeah. We then had a section which was specific areas of grammar or of writing. Now, these were just sort of thrown out there. We decided these before we started, and I would change most of them now, having gone through trying to mark them like this. So the top one is agreement. Do the nouns and the verbs agree with each other? Is there an issue with that? Punctuation. Now, obviously, if you're writing one sentence, probably the only punctuation you're going to see is a full stop at the end for most students. But we also took into account capitalization, whether or not they've used any more complex punctuation, like this student here has put a semicolon, so that's got to be worth a mark, hasn't it? So all of this is compiled into their score for their summaries.
So this is 5 articles that a student has read and they've summarised 5 articles?
Correct, yeah. Yeah. And they've been given a maximum of 6 minutes to do it. So this is how we ended up with this result here. So the question really is, how much of this can I do automatically so that rather than using the time they've taken, I can actually use something more relevant, much more relevant, to decide whether to give them something more difficult or something easier. And you may also ask, what's the point of giving them something more difficult and easier? Why not just give them, you know, the same text or whatever? The advantage of this is that when you've got 169 texts, there's no way that anyone can learn all of that and get the answers to these. So it means that this test can be used for a long period of time without having to rewrite materials. Now, okay, thank you. I'd just like to mention, and I'm sorry for this, but I think it's obligatory in this, that we mention ChatGPT, isn't it? Isn't that? We're supposed to do that. So one thing that I did do here, rather than writing all of those summaries, you can get ChatGPT to write all the summaries. You just give them the text and say, write those summaries for me, which is a time saving, definitely. So we've got 3 columns here. We've got tutor written ones, we've got student written ones, and we've got ChatGPT written ones. I'd love to give you 20 minutes to try and work out which one's which. But what I actually found was that the ChatGPT ones were absolutely fine. There was no issue with them at all, because we're not using those as a model for students. We're simply using those as a reminder to us what the text was about, and for us to be able to compare it with the student's text. And ChatGPT is very good at summarizing. If you tell it to summarize a text, it'll do it for you. It's not so good at summarizing it in 1 sentence. Sometimes it does it in 2, and you have to join them together. But so that's a saving. That's a saving we can have. But if we go back here, you will see that there's also other things that we have to look at. But what we could be doing is, we could be analysing the student's output in the same way that we analysed the text in the first place, for readability. So we could be looking at the level of their language, we could be looking at the length of their sentence. We can very easily look at punctuation. We can see if there is punctuation. Whether it's being used correctly or not is another question. So again, it would have to be some sort of finger in the wind. It would not be a perfect measure. Unless, of course, you got ChatGPT to do all this scoring for you, which again, it's possible. It's very scary. But I do believe that ChatGPT is very useful for creation of materials, at least the first stage of it. It saves an awful lot of racking your brains. Can I think of another example of X grammatical point? So it's very useful from that point of view. So if we just go on. Okay. Once the students had been through the whole thing, they would be given automatically, automatically, once we had marked their summaries, they'd be given a breakdown of all of the different sections of that, which had links to things that they could study to improve these sections. So, for example, the time taken. Here we have a reader who is reading quite slowly. So one of the key skills, obviously, for academics is to read in different ways. So we can take them on to a critical reading short course and cover that need for them. This student, however, has got very good vocabulary, and therefore we don't need to cover that. Now, the advantage of this is that you're only giving them the input that they require. You're not giving them a blanket of, this is what everyone needs, so you're going to do it as well. And this seemed to work quite well, because we were targeting very specific things and allowing students to dive into self-access materials. And there were also a couple of courses that they could join if they had particular issues with this. But the reason that I'd created this in the first place was because I want to put IELTS in Room 101, because I find that the students who come to us after such exams that are really looking at their English level, they don't have the study skills. And in fact, a lot of native speaker students don't have the study skills. So I think it's really important to give them tests that have integrated skills. But the complexity of that is how do you automatically know how difficult something is when it is an integrated skill? And you can't judge how quickly someone can read unless they produce some output, because you don't know whether they've actually taken anything in at all. So that's the point I'm at. So I am hoping that I will be able to develop more automation into this. And this is not because, again, I want to get rid of teachers marking things. It's simply because I don't see a need for teachers to be marking this kind of thing. I think that all of this can be done reasonably automatically. Okay? So I haven't got much time left, I don't think. I think 5 minutes, okay. But what I would be very interested in is any ideas that you have about this, any questions you have, of course, but I'd also be interested to know if you think there are any exercises that would be valid in this sort of context and how they could be realized online. So I'll open the floor up to you.